Hello and welcome everybody to this online event, another event by the Hellenic Observatory here at the London School of Economics, an online research seminar and part of the events program of the public events program of the London School of Economics. Our seminar today is on the topic of evaluating the impact of labor market reforms in Greece during the 2010-2018. Which is the period of the adjustment programs in Greece. And we're very, very pleased to have with us to present his research, Professor Nicos Vettas, who I'm going to briefly introduce before passing on the floor to him. Professor Nicos Vettas is Professor of Economics at the Athens University of Economics and Business, but he's also General Director of the Foundation for Economic and Industrial Research, EUROMOD Institute in Athens. He has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and he is taught previously before going to Athens as associate professor at Duke University. He has served as associate editor in the International Journal of Industrial Organization. He's a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research, a member of the Executive Committee of the European Association for Research in Industrial Economics. He's been associate editor of the Journal of European Economic Association and of the Journal of Industrial Economics. He's been a member of the Hellenic Competition Commission and also in the Economic Advisory Group for Competition Policy for the European Commission. Also involved in a great institution for doctoral studies in Greece, the Conference for Research on Economic Theory and Econometrics, a very important annual conference that happens obviously every year in nice locations in Greek islands. He has published widely in very important economics journals in his field of industrial economics, including the International Economic Review, European Economic Review, the Rand Journal of Economics, and the Review of Economic Studies. Also, he's quite known to people studying the austerity programs in Greece and the adjustment programs as a co-editor of the 2017 book Beyond Austerity Reform in the Greek Economy, which was published by the MIT Press. The work that Professor Vettas will be presenting today relates, as I'm sure he will tell us, relates to a research project that he's been running with a number of colleagues and which has been funded by the Hellenic Observatory. And for that, I think we should also acknowledge the financial support for the research schemes that we run here at the Hellenic Observatory, the financial support by Dr. Vassilis Apostolopoulos and the Laskaridis Foundation. The project that Professor Vettas will report was on the evaluating the labor market reforms in Greece, but we cover not only economics topics, but the wider topics of relevance to Greece and the wider region where Greece is located. Now, before I pass on the floor, and apologies for the longest introduction, a couple of announcements. For those using Twitter, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Greece. And the event is being recorded. Hopefully, it will be made available as a podcast if we don't have any technical difficulties. So you should be aware when, if you want to, the type of questions you want to ask. The questions will follow the presentation. We'll receive questions from the audience through the chat function of Zoom. You can submit them there. If you're listening from Facebook, I think there's a facility also to submit your questions through Facebook, and they will come to me. I will address the questions to the speaker, and then we'll try to answer or to engage with as many questions as possible. So on Facebook, you can add your questions as comments. On Zoom, you can ask your questions to the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. So I hope we'll have a lively and interesting debate, but first, the very exciting presentation by Professor Vettas. Nico, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vassili. I'm very happy and honored to be part of this lecture series. As you said, this draws on a research project that is being supported by the Hellenic Observatory, so I'm grateful to you and the donors, Vassilis Apostolopoulos and the Laskaridis Foundation. I can now jump into the presentation, which is on a topic that is that still attracts a lot of heated debate as to what worked and what hasn't worked about labor market reforms in Greece. Labor market reforms were, I guess, along with pensions, the two central and more controversial and politically also hot reform areas during the 3 consecutive programs in Greece. In some sense, labor market reforms received more attention early on, around 2012 and 2014 was most of the action. Pension reforms actually followed on mostly a little bit later. Despite the importance, there hasn't been much research about what worked and what hasn't worked. Partly because this is a difficult question. We try to describe what happened and then tackle this question by building certain counterfactuals. In other words, if certain parts of reforms hadn't taken place, what would have happened? Naturally, our approach, like every such approach, has a number of limitations about general equilibrium effects, about how you build these counterfactuals, and so on and so forth. Let me try to share my screen. So hopefully now you can see my slides. And let me start with the important part, which is that this research is joined with 3 colleagues, George Katopoulos, Alexandros Louka, and Yannis Polikarpou. Each one of them knows a lot more about empirical work and labor markets than myself. So bear with me as I'm going to go through a labor market paper with empirical stuff, which is not exactly my bread and butter. Still, I think there is some interesting stuff here. I'm gonna preempt some of the criticism by saying that what we have here is not the last word on the topic, but we are opening up some discussion. So the context here is that Greece went through 3 consecutive bailout programs, during which there was legislation and implementation. These are not always in Greece the same thing, of various reforms. And there was a dual aim of those, fiscal sustainability and then building external competitiveness for the economy. And in terms of structural reforms, whereas there was an initial ambition to also tackle product market reforms, it is clear that labor market reforms were deeper and started also earlier, at least in terms of implementation. So it's important to understand what these reforms did. That's exactly the objective of this research here. What was first of all, to evaluate the impact of these labor market reforms on the incentives at a microeconomic level of individuals to enter the formal labor market. We're going to focus on this because, as you may or you may not know, Greece has a very sizable informal labor market. And the boundaries between the two are crucial, especially during a crisis period when the incentives change. Then we have a supplementary approach, which is to estimate the impact of those reforms on some macro indicators. So we're going to combine a micro and a macro approach. So the first approach is going to be on building simulations at the level of households. And then you compare whether the household, how these reforms affected incentives of the household to participate or not to participate. The second approach is more top-down, And then we built what is called generalized synthetic control method, which allows to structure counterfactual paths. Basically ask if some particular reforms hadn't taken place, and we start with 2012, what would happen, what would have happened, and then we compare the actual with those counterfactuals. Now, the stylized facts on the Greek labor market are actually quite interesting. Here they are very briefly outlined in terms of bullets. Relative to European comparisons, the Greek labor market exhibits low productivity. We also saw, and that's actually a well-documented fact, that the unit labor cost, what we refer here at ULC, increased higher than productivity in the pre-crisis period. According to many researchers, this was a significant ingredient of what led to the crisis. But there are also additional structural features of this market. One is a low participation rate. Participation rate is systematically low in Greece relative to other European economies, especially when it comes to women and younger people. In addition, unemployment rate was high in Greece even before the crisis period. So even before 2008, in Greece, we had systematically higher unemployment than in comparison countries. The tax wedge, no matter how you measure it, was significantly high. Has been significantly high. Flexible employment forms were of very low use during the pre-crisis period. So it's interesting to see what happened after the crisis started. There was a very significant mismatch that has been documented between demand and supply in the market, and very limited outreach of vocational and educational programs and training. The informal labor market has been very strong in Greece, and a very high share of self-employment, the highest in Europe. So if you combine all this, this builds a labor market picture that is not exactly what you see in an average European country. Now, let me now talk about this one feature that I mentioned before, that basically in one sentence, we can say that wages grew faster than productivity in the pre-crisis, in the pre-2008 period. Basically, you see that in each of these panels, these are different ways to measure pretty much the same thing. So on the top left panel, we see the nominal unit labor cost. All these are measurements that actually we did not create. They come from AMECO. Nominal unit labor cost is defined as the ratio of compensation per employee to real GDP per person employed. And all the other comparisons are kind of self-explanatory. Basically, we see that wages grew faster than productivity going towards 2008, and then there was a correction. In each of those comparisons, basically, there are two things moving at the same time. One is wages, the other is productivity. Okay, so this is one. The second systematic feature of the Greek labor markets is what I mentioned before, low labor participation. Participation in the labor market obviously is not the same thing as employment. These are the people who are in principle willing to work. And basically, so regardless of whether they are employed or they are unemployed. And basically, we see that participation, if you focus on the top left panel, you see that labor force participation has been growing in Greece. However, it lags behind the EU average and in fact most European economies. The increase that we see is driven mainly by what you see at the top right panel, which is an increase in the female labor force participation, which has been going up, although that one is significantly lagging behind the European averages. Interestingly, if you look at top down, you see labor force participation for young people, and this over the years has been decreasing, probably reflecting, I'm just describing the data here, probably reflecting an increased willingness to stay at school longer. So this can be education at a higher level, at different institutions, postgraduate or graduate. Whereas we see, interestingly enough, in the bottom right panel, the participation rate for people over 50. We also see that these participation rates after the crisis started, so basically after 2010, instead of going up for about 5 years or 6, it was going down. Part of the reason for that must have been that reform in the pensions system that made it less of a good bargain to stay at work. People were trying to retire before the system would become less advantageous for them. So basically what we see is labor force participation lagging behind the EU benchmarks. That's the total. And that's something to keep in mind, because when we evaluate the impact of the reforms, we're going to say some good things and some bad things about the outcomes. And one of the bad things we're going to say, one of the negative outcomes, is that really we haven't tackled in Greece this problem of the systematically low labor force participation. Now, an important bit that complements this picture is a tax wedge. Now, the tax wedge, again, can be measured in a number of ways. What we have on the left is we put on the numerator the total that is withheld for Social Security. So these Social Security contributions is not just for pensions, it's also for healthcare, unemployment, and so on and so forth. The numerator has the gross wage of the individual. So basically you see Greece having a higher ratio of that relative to the Eurozone, relative to the OECD average, relative to Spain and Portugal. Now, another comparison that you could make that's a little bit different. On the right, we see the average tax wedge. So here we subtract not only Social Security contributions, but also income taxes. And we put in the denominator the total of labor costs. So this is not the gross wage, this is what the employer pays. And again, we actually see that Greece is the top line. So according to that metric, the burden of this tax wedge is more severe in Greece than in pretty much every comparison that you have made. Now, one little thing that you can see is that during the 2012-2015 period, there has been signs that this gap has been narrowing. You can see this on the right panel and on the left panel. However, this progress has been stalled since then. So that's another important feature of the Greek labor market. High tax wedge, low labor force participation. An additional feature that is important to document is about flexible forms of employment, which in Greece has had limited outreach. So we see that part-time employment has been increasing over the years around the crisis in Greece. But Greece still remains the bottom of all the lines to which we're comparing on the left, with some fatigue in this from 2017. And it's also interesting that when people are asked about the nature of this part-time employment, they say this is involuntary. Okay, so this is much more in Greece than pretty much anywhere else in the comparison. In other words, those who are working part-time, they don't like it, much less than in the rest of Europe. So this is not in some sense something that is considered normal or part of how the economy should work, that part of the employment could be part-time, but more like an anomaly that should be avoided. Now, this is a little bit hard to explain exactly why, but according to the measurement we have, looks like average working hours in Greece, this is for wage earners, so this is leaving out self-employment, but this is on average high. So we see this for the full-time wage earners and the part-time wage earners. It's hard to distinguish exactly what are the factors that are driving this. There was actually a negative trend pre-crisis. So people were working less and less. You see, it starts above 40 hours per week, and then it was going down below 40 hours. I'm sorry, it was going it was starting about 41 hours per week on average, going a little bit lower than 40 hours per week, but then it has gone up more. This may mean, this may be because the market works in such a way that it tries to pay overtime to currently employed people rather than perhaps to hire more people. But this is something that actually is interesting and demands more study and more data. But actually, it would be a mistake to describe the labor markets in Greece without noticing that Greece has a very high share of self-employment. Basically, you see here, this is self-employed people as a percentage of total labor force. It's around 25% of the total labor force. This is not actually a percentage of those who do work. If you do it as a percentage of those who do work, the percentage is actually even higher, right? Here in the denominator, we also put people who are unemployed. This high percentage continued even after the labor market reforms, despite the fact that we saw a convergence with other peers in Europe during the period 2012 and 2015. Just to put it in simple terms, during those years, self-employment was actually hit. Notice that this includes also employment in the public sector, which was actually not hit much when it came to permanent public sector employees. Now, so this is kind of a nice, I think, set of pictures for the Greek labor markets. Let us now turn to what was the set of reforms during the programs. As I said previously, these reforms primarily took place early on in the programs, with their peak in 2012 and 2014. They had a twofold objective: to support the adjustment in the economy through more flexible labor market regulations, and to enhance gains in cost and competitiveness. The latter is also, can also be understood in what has been called the process of internal devaluation, since the Greek economy could not gain competitiveness through a currency devaluation. Internal devaluation was a path that was selected. So here I'm just being descriptive. I'm not arguing what was wrong or what was right. Now, going back to what was the first of the two objectives described here, the idea was to, when the crisis hit, and we're talking about a huge crisis, that actually was more than 1/4 of the Greek GDP actually was wiped out during these first crisis years. So the real GDP declined by more than 25% cumulatively. So the rationale was to assist the adjustment in the labor market, so that the adjustment would take place to a larger extent through prices than through volumes. Okay, to put this in a less politically correct manner, that the adjustment would take place more by not having people going to unemployment, but decreasing their wages. And during the idea was that this would actually facilitate the landing of the economy during the crisis, but would also lead to a faster unemployment recovery once the economy actually returns to growth. The second of these objectives, as I said, was to strengthen cost competitiveness. In other words, that Greek businesses would find labor cheaper. And it is a documented fact that during the first decade of the euro adoption, the Greek economy price competitiveness significantly weakened during the euro area average, during also most of the eurozone periphery. And in the absence, as I mentioned before, of an exchange rate mechanism, reducing or more flexibility in the labor market was viewed as a tool that would actually lead to increased competitiveness and fast. So there were there were 5 key areas for labor reforms, and those were distinct. Collective bargaining, national minimum wage, not age, apologies for the typo, employment protection, flexible forms of employment, and the labor tax wage. Now, in terms of let me say a word about each one of those. I'm going to be quick because the point is to go to an evaluation of what this did. Basically, collective bargaining increased flexibility in the system. It made it more decentralized in a sense that bargaining at the firm level would often take priority over what might have been at a higher level. Once the relevant workers and employers were able to agree. Now, the point here was to facilitate adjustment, again, as I said before, via wages rather than volume. In other words, not to lead to an even more drastic increase in unemployment, but to keep people employed even at lower wages. Then there was a change in the national minimum wage. The idea here was twofold. Was first of all a one-off significant decrease in the minimum wage that took place early on in the program, so that to avoid especially lower skilled people being priced out of the formal labor market and moved into the shadow market. And then there was also a new mechanism that was put in place, where there was a trilateral participation, not just the social partners, but also involve the government, so that there was also a representation of those who were the outsiders in the labor market. So there was a one-off significant decrease in the minimum wage, but then there was also a new mechanism that was different than before that was put in place. There were also changes in employment protection. Greece had quite rigid rules about laying people off. So these reforms facilitated the firm's responsiveness to economic cycle at the extensive margin. This means, in other words, that it became easier for firms to fire people in two ways. First of all, the compensation the firms had to give in order to fire people were diminished on average. And second, the percentage of the employees that one could fire at a given year increased. So the idea here, at least initially, was that this increased flexibility would actually encourage firms to hire more people, because it would then be harder, it would be easier to fire them if it turned out that actually this employment was no longer needed. That was the idea. Then you went to flexible forms of employment in the sense of part-time work, increase the ability to shift overtime, and so on and so forth. The idea here again is that to make it easier to work in the formal labor market rather than the informal labor market. And finally, there is all these ideas about lowering this very high labor tax wedge. This was something, everything else that I said before was and still is one way or another controversial. And you are going to find people at both sides of the argument, if this was in principle correct, or if this was in principle a bad idea, and also whether in practice it worked or in practice it was a bad idea. Now, this fifth element, decreasing the tax wedge, was something that everybody in the labor market is going to tell you it's a good idea, because this benefits the employers as well as the employees. The only thing is that this has a fiscal cost. But we do show that this fiscal cost actually was a significant part of what worked in practice, both in terms of what helped the labor market and more broadly. Now, this is a list of exactly what happened. I'm not going to go through it, just notice the years. Most of what happened was around 2012. And then another series of reforms in 2014 that I'm going to mention so that I don't overburden you. I don't go through this list. This is a little bit of a record of what actually did happen. Now I'm going to go in turn to two approaches that we have with my colleagues adopted in this project. First, a micro level approach, and then a macro, more top-down approach. The results of each actually nicely complement each other. In one particular area, both give you the same result, as we're going to see, and then we're going to conclude. Now, the micro level approach actually builds on employment incentives. So it goes to the level of the individual and basically ask what are the incentives to work, and for that matter to work in the formal labor market in Greece. Basically what we do is we construct a micro-founded proxy for the counter-incentives of employment. Put it differently, we ask under different policy regimes, what is it that I gain if I do work in the formal market, and what it is that I do if I do not work in the formal market and I become unemployed. This is basically the comparison. We compare how these incentives have evolved during the programs, but also across individual and household characteristics, because the effect was not the same for all of those. Then we turn to a particular year, 2014, when we had an interesting experiment, a natural experiment from the viewpoint of the economist, as there was a reduction in the employees' social security contributions by 1 percentage point. This happened once, and we can actually simulate what was the effect that this had on employment incentives. We do need to have changes that take place on the employee side in order to be able to talk about employment incentives. Now, a little bit more about some detail now about how this works. We are employing a tool called EUROMOD. Those of you working in labor economics, at least with European markets, you may be familiar with that. This is a micro simulation model, has been developed by the European Commission and the University of Essex. And what it does is it applies different changes in tax and benefits policies. So it fixes the policy system within a year, and then it simulates how taxes, benefits, social security contributions, and disposable income to each household after the system rules change. So this is what that is. The data that is being used is micro data at the household level. This is what is called SILC. It's being coordinated by the European Union. So this is the European level statistics on income and living conditions. And we have that for Greece. This is collected in each country, and then it's being coordinated centrally. And we can apply a number of filters here. In this exercise, we're going to focus on the wage earners. So we can isolate from the whole data set this category of individuals. In particular, we are going to simulate, we have simulated the components that impact labor market participation incentives at the extensive margin. And those are taxes that have to be paid, benefits received, social insurance contributions that need to be paid, as well as labor earnings. This here is a description of the data sample that we have. It is quite large. For 2008, it's a little bit short than 10,000 people. You can see here the characteristics in case you are interested. This is not a panel. This is a repeated cross section, and from that data set, we're going to select the ones that we are interested in. The main instrument that we're going to work with, we are construct this formula that you see, which is called participation tax rate. So the participation tax rate basically tries to measure, as I said before, how much you benefit if you decide to go on one side of the line rather than the other side of the line. So this measures, this is a proxy for employment counter incentives. For instance, if unemployment benefits are extremely high in any given country, and ceteris paribus, this would actually show that the incentives to work would be actually quite high, quite low. In particular, this is defined as the share of the gross labor income. This is actually at the denominator. And in the numerator, we have the difference between the household's disposable income when the individual is employed minus the disposable income of that individual if he or she is unemployed. So we have micro data because obviously wages and social security and taxes and all that, they are not the same for each individual. So this is in some sense the strength of Silk and EUROMOD. We can actually proceed with that. So here is one big picture that is of interest.
Nico, very sorry to interrupt. Just to give you 10 minutes warning, if you can make sure you cover the whole presentation. So 10, 12 minutes we should be.
Yes, great. Thank you, Vassilis. So here is one big picture to take away. Basically, you can see that this participation tax rate in 2018, so this is light blue, relative to 2010, which is dark blue, increased. We see this across all income deciles, and we actually see this also across all income groups. This basically means that the counter incentives for employment increased, not decreased, during 2012-2018. We also see that when you compare light blue with dark blue, that the difference is stronger when it comes to people at the low income decile and people at low ages, at younger ages. And we can also do this for female versus male population. Basically, this was stronger for younger male population. This can have a number of explanations, but basically it shows that if you consider everything that took place in the 8 years after 2010, the incentives to work actually went the other way. Now, one particularly interesting variable that contributed to that was obviously the fact that the disposable income went down. So here you see the disposable income. This is not in the whole of Greece. This is in the sample that we have. You see a very huge drop. For people not familiar with the Greek crisis, these numbers seem unbelievable. But basically, you see on average disposable income going down during these 8 years by about 25%. This was as a result of the fiscal consolidation measures, the higher unemployment, the increased taxes, and so on and so forth. So this is one thing that we see. Now, then we focus on 2014. And 2014, we had one particular reform, which was that there was one item within the social security contributions that the employees were paying. This was decreased by 1 percentage point. So this creates a nice natural experiment, and we can simulate what happened with this data set before and after. So we estimate the participation tax rate prior and after this 1% decrease. And basically we see what happened in the disposable income as a result of that. This is a total disposable income of the household. So on average, this decreased a little bit less than 1%. This is also because, yes, maybe the social security contribution decreased by 1%, but this now becomes taxable income. So part of that was taxed and was taken away from the household. So you can simulate this across the income deciles. So this goes from 0.4% to 1.2%. However, we now interestingly see that the counter incentives for employment as a result of this 2014 reform actually dropped, and they dropped significantly. Okay, they dropped for every income decile and for every age group. This is not surprising because this is actually now more money in your pocket if you do work relative or if you don't work, but we actually quantify how much that was. And this is interesting because both during the programs, but also exposed, there hasn't been much of an estimate of how much each of these reforms contributed or not contributed. You can do other things. We can combine with a separate study that we have done at IOBE about a year ago, where we estimated an elasticity that translates this participation tax rate into labor force participation. And if you do all this and you believe this elasticity of 0.75 percentage points, this basically says that this 1% decrease in the Social Security contribution that took place in 2014 increased labor force participation by about 0.4 percentage points. Now, is this large? Is this small? Well, given that participation rates in the labor force market in Greece have been lagging behind the European average by about 4 percentage points, 0.4% is not huge. And in fact, if you run the simulation, you see that for female and younger population, the improvement is even less. However, it is something, it is sizable, and we can actually show that this one worked. Now let's go to the complementary approach in our study, which is a macro approach. Even though this is macro, it refers to macro variables, we don't actually build here a macroeconomic model. However, what we do is we put Greece in the context of a cross-country level study, and we estimate counterfactual paths for selected macro and other social indicators if those labor market reforms would not take place. As we argue in the paper, which I guess after some comments will become soon available, this is this is an approach that works better than a more standard diff in diff approach for a number of reasons. This generalized synthetic control method follows 4 steps that are actually outlined here. And let me actually, the number of caveats one can say, one can describe. However, there are reasons to believe that this works better than some alternatives. This method has been used by the IMF to evaluate similar reforms in Spain recently. Let me jump to the conclusions. So I would like, okay, for each one of the slides, I'm going to show to you what I have on the left is actually 3 countries together, Greece, Portugal, and Spain. So I'm running this for the 3 countries together. And then on the right, I have Greece. What you see before 2012 is actually fitting the model to the data. What you see after 2012 is actually generating a counterfactual about what would have happened if these labor market reforms had not taken place. And here I'm talking about all the labor market reforms that took place in 2012. So I'm not isolating one of them. So also just to note before I embark on describing the results, that like all econometrics works better locally. So after you go away, if the more away you go from 2012, the less I should believe my results, the closer I stay around 2013, 14, 15, the more robust these results are. So one thing that so how should you read this? So look, for example, at the right panel, and you see the solid line. The solid line is exactly what happened. And now we're talking about employment growth in percentage terms. And the dotted line is the path that employment would have followed if the reforms would not have taken place. So in some sense here, you say the reforms worked. Okay, by doing all of these things that we described, the employment growth actually was stronger than what it would have taken place if the reforms were not implemented. Okay, the solid line is higher than the dotted line. Then we look separately at unemployment. And here again, you see that unemployment in Greece would have been higher if the reforms would not have taken place. Similar is also true for when you do it for the three countries together, combined at the left. Here, however, you see something a little bit different. Here is labor force participation. So the participation rate, but this is estimated with a top-down, a macro approach, different from the micro approach we had before. And actually here you see that if the reforms, if the reforms had not taken place, you see the solid line now is below the dotted line, so labor force participation would have been higher. How you explain this? It also has to do with the path that wages followed, that in fact disposable income followed. In some sense, whereas unemployment benefits decreased during the crisis, incomes, if you are working, decreased even more. And that's the difference that drives this gap. Then you can also estimate what happened with part-time employment. Here you also see that if the 2012 reforms would not have taken place, part-time employment would have been less. So in some sense here you see a success of the program. Here is the average hours worked for people that are working full-time. This is a little bit harder to explain, especially when you see that in Spain and Portugal, the results were different, but basically you see that at least according to their self-reporting, average hours worked in Greece went up a lot. The counterfactual would have been that they would have been going down. You see, I'm going away from this a little bit fast because this can be a really long discussion. And this is actually very interesting because this is, as far as I know, the first estimate on how these labor market reforms affected the unit labor cost. So basically you see that unit labor cost in Greece did go down significantly during the programs. So after 2012, you see the very significant increase before 2012. Again, we're talking about Greece, the blue line. We see that this went down significantly after 2012, but we also built this counterfactual that shows that it would have been much, much higher, by about 10% higher, if the reforms had not taken place. So this is an estimate, you may like it or not like it, but it is an estimate about the effect that the 2012 reforms had on unit labor cost. Unit labor cost, these reforms, however, on the other hand, increased inequality. So again, focus more about what happened the first year after 2012. You see the solid line, which is what really happened. After 2012 went up, whereas the dotted line, which is what would have happened if the reforms had not taken place, would have been lower. So there was more, this is the Gini coefficient that measures variance in the labor market incomes. So we see that the reforms actually increase this inequality in actual incomes. And finally, we do the same thing about the effect of this 2014 reduction in the social security contributions. And we saw that the participation rate indeed increased. So this macro approach actually comes to confirm what we found from the micro approach. So the participation rate would have been much lower if this change had not taken place. So I'm concluding, as I said before, we definitely do not claim this is the last word in evaluating the effect of labor market reforms. one has a lot of work to do thinking about a number of avenues that I'm going to describe in a second. However, we actually document a mixed picture. First of all, these were radical labor market reforms. So this gives us a great opportunity from an economist viewpoint to evaluate empirically. The evidence that we present suggests that one of the incentives, which was the increase in cost competitiveness and then increase in relative employment and all of that, this was largely fulfilled. So here is a check. On the other hand, in conjunction to that, we also had this increased flexibility in labor market regulations, also supported the objective that we're going to have a significant part of the adjustment through prices, wages, that is, than through volumes. So this is also a check. If you believe that this was an incentive of the labor market reforms, yes, it contributed, it helped cost competitiveness, and yes, it helped more people keep their jobs than otherwise. However, these reforms left mostly unaddressed long-standing weaknesses of the Greek labor market, such as the low labor force participation, the informal market, the strong informal market, and the high tax wedge. I think this set of conclusions actually can lead to a very long discussion as to whether in total these reforms were beneficial and where and why. What would have been the outcomes if other reforms like in the product market would have taken priority over labor market reforms, whether the fiscal consolidation actually contributed or not contributed to a success of the reforms in the labor market. I don't need to abuse your time and go one more time through the conclusions. I said this, however, it's important to think about policy priorities.
Nico, in 1 minute, if you can, please.
Yes, because it is true that while significant adjustment in the labor market did take place during these many years, there are areas that remain where the labor markets remain structurally weak. There is a very significant mismatch in skills. So demand and supply don't communicate well. So you do need to do a lot more on the front of vocational and educational training, active labor market policies, thinking about undeclared work, and overall, how at the same time you're going to increase labor productivity, but also reduce unemployment rates and inequality. There is a lot more to discuss here, but Vassili, I already feel that I abused my time. This is the set of results we have up to now, and I hope this is food for thought. Thank you.
Nico, thank you very much. A lot of material, a wealth of material, and very interesting. In normal circumstances, we'd have a round of applause now for at the end of the presentation, but we'll leave it for notionally afterwards at the end of the seminar. I would like, before opening the floor for questions and answers, to ask you a couple of questions while people also, as I say, collect their thoughts and type in the questions. We already have a few, but I'll try to give a bit more time. What I would like to ask is, I imagine that would be a question that a good colleague Manolis Gallianos would be probably asking, so I hope I'm not stealing his question. But you mentioned towards the end of the conclusions that tick box the reforms seem to have improved the situation with regard to cost competitiveness. And I guess if one looks at it from the factual side, the price side, so unit labor costs went down. So I understand the argument, and of course, you know, the synthetic control analysis was doing that. But if you look at the export performance of the country, at least for the until maybe 2016, exports hadn't picked up, and part of the explanation could be that the shock of the recession was so big, the cash flow. So companies had cash flow problems. It was very difficult to get credit in order to export to international markets. So even though the unit labor cost went down, maybe the kind of collateral damage of the reforms was that it deprived the productive sector from being able to export. I know this, you cannot possibly comment on that on the basis of the counterfactual analysis, but would you like to talk a bit about that, whether the cost, so focus on cost competitiveness perhaps overlooked the other things that matter for exports, which is not just the price. And then another question that I would like to relate to the other conclusion about the labor force participation. And you seemed in the presentation, I mean, obviously the reforms aimed at changing the incentives for people to participate. And you seem to focus on that in the presentation, obviously for good reasons. But I guess a lot of action happened on early retirement and whatever happened with people choosing to leave before they lose their pension entitlement. So I wonder whether the results are kind of consistent if you focus at narrower age groups, say people up to the age of 55, that didn't have the opportunity to retire. So it is really about incentives rather than about movements of people in and out of big categories in the labor market. So if you would like to share any thoughts on these points.
Right, thank you, because both points are actually quite interesting and valid. Let me start from perhaps the second one. The exercise we're running is the incentive to participate in the formal labor market, and we do believe this is an important exercise to run through. It is, however, in some sense a static exercise, because it looks at any given point in time what are the current benefits if you work and what are the benefits if you don't work. You would like to build perhaps a dynamic decision about exiting the labor market for good, going into retirement. This would show in the data as to actually who opted for early retirement, for instance, and who didn't. But that doesn't actually diminish the value of the exercise, which is the incentive to work within a given year, right? So, in fact, if we show in the data that even though the participation tax rate was actually going the wrong way, people were retiring, we would say, well, it is because they would like to lock in a better pension before the pension parameters actually. But here we see that actually both go the same way. So a number of people had an incentive to go to early retirement, and at the same time, people that were working in the formal labor market actually had a weaker incentive to do this prior to before. Now, that doesn't mean this was a result of the reforms, but this was also a result of the crisis. This was the result of the crisis because if you did get to keep your job, you are making actually a lower disposable income than in 2018 than what you would be making in 2010. But since you mentioned it, this is something that we are discussing with the research team, building a more dynamic, this would have to be more like an exit model of dynamic programming as to anticipating, with uncertainty, of course, because this is Greece, as to whether you would go to pension or not. That's one thing. Now, going back to the issues of competitiveness here, this is a long discussion, but we do not argue that total competitiveness went up. Okay, we argue here that these reforms contributed towards competitiveness. There are other parts of, in particular, that had to do with business environment and we do know that that part of competitiveness went the wrong way. And in most of the rankings that have to do with business environment, Greece was actually was in retreat. This had to do with uncertainty in the country. It had to do with an increased cost of financing, and so on and so forth. So here we isolate one part. And it is actually well known that unit labor costs went down and contributed towards competitiveness. The unfortunate part is that there were not more variables that would contribute towards this total competitiveness. Now, having said that, it is actually not true that, and that's another long discussion, to what extent you would expect exports to go up. Exports did go up during the programs more in some other countries, like in Spain. However, in particular parts of the market, you do see exports of goods going up significantly and systematically, at least when you do this in value. So exports of goods is now much higher than when it was 7 or 8 years back. Interestingly, this took a while. This basically says that once your domestic product markets collapse, you do not necessarily find it immediate to sell abroad. You need to connect yourself within international value chains. You need to convince your trading partners that you are low risk, so that they would start trading with you. And that was very hard for those of us who remember how Greece was during the 3 programs. It was not low risk. So it took some years for a number of companies to find their place in global value chains, but they did. And after that, in certain parts of the market, significantly, we saw exports increasing, albeit with a delay.
Yeah. Thanks, Nico. I see that actually my questions are also asked by a couple of people in the audience. So I'll reiterate these questions and see if you would like to add something on that, on the same point. So there is a question by Nicolos Dimoulas, who says labor market reforms were prescribed mainly to remedy the uncompetitiveness of Greek exports and to a lesser extent to facilitate import substitution. Looking back at the poor performance of the country on these grounds, even as we speak, were the measures materially effective? So going back on the question, but I guess your answer is already given that that part of the equation worked, but the other contextual factors and the reforms did not necessarily help.
Right. So here we measure the impact of labor market reforms, holding everything else in the equation fixed. But it is well known, and it's kind of natural that competitiveness means a lot more than labor market reforms.
Yeah. Okay, so the other one has to do again with pensions and the retirees and labor force participation. So Aris Nikolopoulou, PhD student at the University of Paris, the question, a part of public policy evaluation is also about the impact on the society in terms of living conditions and so forth. Do you think that the internal devaluation changed structurally this aspect in Greece? Sorry, this is a different question than the pensions, but so do you think that the internal devaluation changed structurally the living conditions of people in Greece in the better, I guess?
Well, as I said, in terms of the labor market reforms, we find a mixed picture, and we try to separate, in some sense, where they worked and where they didn't work. To sum up, they worked in terms of contributing towards cost competitiveness.
I think
they worked towards changing the mix between higher unemployment and lower wages. But they did not work in addressing these more structural problems that I described before: the low labor force participation, the high tax wedge, and the high informal sector. Now, in order to think what was the impact of all this for people working in Greece, you have to evaluate the impact and then the middle run. To put it a little bit differently, obviously, this was a very severe crisis, as severe as we have seen in decades in Europe. So it is absolutely natural that during these years, the average household suffered and suffered very severely. The questions then the questions you have to answer are two. One is to what extent the cost of this crisis, how the cost of this crisis was shared across the economy. And we said a few things about this. And secondly, to what extent these reforms helped stop the recession and then helped increase GDP growth, in particular through a contribution to exports. So it is definitely a mixed bag. But if one expects an answer that says that due to these labor market reforms that happened in 2012 and 2014, this led to an increase in the absolute welfare of households, certainly this did not happen and could not have happened.
Hi, Nico. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Yes, yeah, okay. So I've been victim of internet connection, so I've lost my connection, but I will try to continue with a couple of questions. I think there was a question by Eleni Louri about the results being mostly, I guess, mainly the EUROMOD, the first part, the microanalysis, being drawn, as you said, for a sample of people who are in salaried employment. But also you mentioned that, as we know, a big proportion of the Greek labor force is self-employed. So the question was, if you're replicating, I guess, this analysis for the self-employed, and to what extent what applies to the salaried people applies, generalizes to the rest of the economy. A related question, not so much, but related to the self-employment issue by Ioannis Laliotis, is about the measurement of self-employed and whether the self-employed includes professionals. I guess it would be, doctors, legal professionals, and so forth. But the question of Eleni Louri is on the generalizability of
right. So both questions refer to what you can do with the simulation. Yes, to the question by Dr. Laliotis, the self-employed certainly includes professionals. So this is clearly in the data set. This is in the SILK data. Now we have focused more on to address the question by my colleague Professor Louri. We have focused more on wage earners because this has been the focus of what these reforms would have, what they would have liked to achieve. And the reform that happened in 2014, which was the decrease in this, because we had this natural experiment in 2014, this actually took place for the wage earners. We could actually run some additional simulations for other parts of the labor force, and we will try to run a number of those when we have the chance. But no, I don't know if the answer of Professor Louri is to do a relative comparison. No, we have not run this.
Right, thanks, Nico. I'm trying to recover some of the questions that were asked previously because I don't have internet connection on my laptop, but from my notes, Vicky Price, to who I sent my greetings, asked if on the basis of the results that you presented, in the grand scheme of things, the reforms were worth it. I think later she made a comment that the later results you showed seem to suggest that the answer is yes, or closer to the yes, but also Eric Klopfer, I think, MSc student at LSE, asked more directly whether you think the internal devaluation strategy worked. I guess you answered that in relation to the cost competitiveness aspect, but could you share some reflection a bit on the question of whether all this was worth the effort, the political upheaval, the social pain, if we're talking, for example, about a change in labor force participation of 0.4 percentage points, which is less than 10% of what we would aspire. And, it was all this, what happened over so many years, worth it in retrospect?
Okay, let's try to be a little bit clear here about our thoughts. The one measurement we had was about what was this 1% decrease in Social Security contributions in 2014. We document and measure how much it increased participation in the labor force participation. We show that it is sizable, significant. However, we show that this is in some sense not enough. But this is not a surprise because the tax wedge in Greece is so significantly higher, and it is still significantly higher, particularly for the wage earners, than in most European countries. So, all this makes sense. Now, you asked a much broader question, which is, you asked if all this was worth it. Now, it depends on what you define as all this. Greece found itself in 2010 cut off from the international financial markets. So various types of adjustments had to be made, and those were on two fronts. You had to proceed with fiscal consolidation, and then you had to proceed with structural reforms. And structural reforms actually had a number of subcategories. Labor market reforms, product market reforms, public sector reforms. So let's actually see how these things interact. Could you actually have adjustment in Greece without reforms in the labor market? In my view, you could not, and actually you should not. We have shown, the data shows very clearly that even before crisis, even in the good, in quote, years, unemployment was high, the tax wedge was high, the informal sector was very strong. And in fact, and that's something that I would like to argue in terms of future research, the Greek labor markets were markets characterized a lot by an asymmetry between insiders and outsiders. And in particular, the outsiders includes a lot those who belong in the category of younger people as well as women. So these reforms were needed. Now, the real question is the interaction. One of the things that we show is that the fact that wages, the fact that disposable income went down because of the crisis actually made it harder to strengthen the incentives for more labor force participation. In other words, yes, the cost of getting unemployed was high, but the cost of keeping your job actually went down as well. So that was one thing. Obviously, if Greece could implement labor market reforms and other structural reforms without the fiscal consolidation, of course, the success and in terms of welfare would have been higher, but that was not possible. Okay?
Yeah. Yep.
So that's that.
Yeah. Okay, Nico, I'll move on to another couple of questions. So Andreas Georgiadis, good colleague and author, also asks whether, because the reforms you presented, or the evaluation you presented, other than the 1 percentage point of the social security contributions, were seen as a bundle. So is there something to be said, especially with regard to kind of future policy implications about specific types of reforms, like the ones that you presented in the beginning of your presentation? So employment protection legislation, minimum wages, are you doing something which is more itemized, if you want, on that?
Now, wait, the one thing that we estimated was the effect of this 2014 1 percentage point decrease. That's one. We also simulated between 2010 and 2018 the total effect of all the changes that we had that affected disposable income. That was the second thing that we showed. And then when we went to the macro approach, we bundled together all the effects that took place in 2012, and we ran a counterfactual. Now, one question is whether you can unbundle this bundle and basically try to see what each of these reforms did. You cannot do this with a macro approach, with a top-down approach. You could create, if you wanted, counterfactuals using EUROMOD, if you wanted, and try to neutralize some of these reforms and try to see what this does to the participation tax rate. Although many of these reforms would not directly affect that. So for instance, changes in the minimum wage do affect it, but changes in the collective bargaining system, then it's hard to see how you would put this across the data. This is more institutional.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Sorry, I'm also joining through. Sorry, I hope this is now okay. You can hear me. I joined back from my computer.
For a moment, I got scared that we have to answer questions by both of you, Vassilis.
Yes, yes. Okay, so another set of questions by Giuseppe Guerra, I think, and Liz Mestenos is about the vocational training, the vocational, the dimension about vocational education. So Giuseppe Guerra says whether vocational training is a solution to impute obviously skills in the labor market and replace, is that something to replace the university entrance exam system and push more from classical education, I guess, to vocational education? I think in the opposite direction, the second question by Ms. Stenos, Liz, I think, is whether there's any evidence that the skills were needed by employers. So it's one thing to say that we need more skills and the skill mismatches, but is there actual evidence that had these skills been available, especially, I guess, during the crisis, they would have been used, and perhaps, may I add, also rewarded sufficiently by the employers?
Right. This is an issue that actually, in some sense, brings us towards dynamics. Labor market participation decisions are not necessarily static. What type of education I'm going to get is not necessarily a static decision. And as well as investment decisions on the front of product markets. This also brings us a little bit to it's a matter of chicken and egg. Basically, implicitly, the question asks, right, so, but even if the people in the labor market had the skills, would they be able to find a job that is suitable for these skills? Okay, first of all, there is a number, so point one is that there is a number of studies that show that there is a mismatch. This is not actually a surprise. It's not a surprise because if you actually compare with a number of other European countries. Greece is an outlier in the sense that its educational system prepares people a lot more for employment in the broader public sector. We can go through this, but a lot less for employment in the industry. However, there was something implicit to the question that you conveyed, which was, yes, but if you put yourself back in 2013 or 2014, would that have made much of a difference, given the fact that you had this huge drop in demand, at least demand within the country, all right? And then we discussed previously about demand for exports. Now, it is true that for those that have been studying, these 10 years of the Greek crisis, the number one thing that you have to describe, and it's really hard to evaluate its effect, but it was extremely dominant, was the burden of uncertainty about the future path of the country. Those of us who lived in Greece during these years, we went through this feeling that if you ask yourself 3 months from now, is the country still gonna be here in one piece? You went through a number of years when the answer was, I'm not sure. So now this did a number of things, okay? It drove out incentives for investment. So investment in Greece started at 25% of GDP. It is still now lower than 12% of GDP. It drove out people with high human capital, the infamous brain drain. And in general, it acted as, it prohibited a number of structural progress in a number of structural reforms. Because if you have nothing to expect, at least you try to preserve what you now have. So this uncertainty was the number one factor. But the fact that this, and this was due to, in my view, an unfortunate management by a number of, pretty much everybody who contributed in this over the 10 years. Having said that, this doesn't mean that as economists, we should not evaluate the impact of various reforms. And looking forward, because Greece, if in the Greek economy, Greece cannot actually go on without increased competitiveness looking forward in the next 10 years. And there are only two ways to do this. Either you are going to go through lower wages, or you will be able to produce more competitive products that are actually higher quality and more innovative. In that sense, you have to make a list of reforms looking forward that are still pending. And it is important to think about the sequencing of these reforms and how they interact. So hopefully what we do contributes in this exercise, contributes towards that.
Thanks, Nico. We've reached the time limit, but I think there is still some active interest from the questions. So I would like to do a last round of questions. Actually, there's first two question suggestions by Stelios Sakas from the European Commission, the Joint Research Center, who asks if you control somehow exactly for what you mentioned, the brain drain in your analysis. So if the analysis controls for this kind of outflow of presumably high-skilled Greeks who left the country, and of course the labor force, and if that affects your results. Also a question by George Koutsumanis, if you have looked in the synthetic control analysis on the impact on aggregate GDP or demand, if you looked at national level income, if you want, effect. So this question's about the analysis. A question by Maria Soukera from the Athens University of Economics and Business, who says, looking at the forthcoming policy priorities, and you mentioned looking ahead with the policy questions. So in relation to the pension reform, would the development of the third pillar help the labor market in Greece? In what way are we ready? So is the private sector, I guess, robust enough for that? So if you could say something about this, the third pillar in the pension reforms, but also the questions about the analysis on GDP impact and the brain drain.
Okay, each one of those is a is a topic for deep analysis by itself. In terms of how you run the macro analysis, yes, you do take trends that take into account GDP growth in the control countries. That's how you create the counterfactuals. Regarding the first question by Dr. Sakas, no, our analysis does not take into account on top of it the effect of the brain drain. You do this within the sample, and the sample is those who are in Greece. So the microanalysis is a simulation for those who have actually stayed in the country, and it compares one margin, which is, should I work in the formal sector or should I get unemployed? It might be interesting if you can actually have a more, a richer and perhaps more dynamic decision, which is actually where you should work. But for that, you know, this is not actually measured in the characteristics of the households we have, they are collecting in the SILK dataset. Finally, there was the question about the pension system. You can actually see in some of our analysis, currently the pension system in Greece, the pension system in Greece has a number of features. One is that it is almost exclusively public sector. So the private part of pensions is actually, even if you include the professional funds, it's actually something like 4% of the total. So it's close to zero, when in Europe it is more, it's a lot more. So one is that it's public sector. B is that it is funded, it's pay as you go. It is pay as you go rather than funded. So basically, this means that if you and what happened during this crisis, during the 10 years of the crisis, was that because of two effects, which was the need for fiscal consolidation. Remember that Greece got into the crisis in 2008 or 9 with a primary budget surplus, with a primary budget deficit of about 10% of GDP and a total deficit of about 15% of GDP. So the fiscal consolidation was not something you could avoid. And in addition, the pension system, along with the demographics, showed that it was actually not viable. So you had to intervene. However, one effect of that was that the average person actually at the end, during these programs, actually lost faith on the stability of the pension system. And the average person, whether currently a worker or a pensioner, actually starting believing that over the years, their pensions is going to be less and less. So the country GDP goes down and their pensions goes down, even though it went down less than the GDP. Now, what this does is that it creates a sense that my social security contributions, if in Greece I am a 25-year-old working, so obviously not me, but a 25-year-old working, this looks like taxation. So there isn't much of a link between what I'm going to contribute and what I can anticipate I'm going to get 30 or 40 years from now. So moving to a system with a strong second and third pillar for pensions, like what there is in most European countries, in my view, is going to strengthen incentives for labor force participation, and it will gradually diminish the incentives to work in the informal sector.
Muted. Thanks, Nico, very much. I guess the question about the pension system is also about how robust, the third pillar can be with the type of employers we have in Greece and how sustainable some of the funds would be. But I'm sure this is another whole different debate that we can have and will continue to have over time, hopefully with more projects funded by the HO and everything. We weren't able to take all questions, including some by good colleagues. Greetings to Maria Tsiapa, Bernard Case, and Theo Papadopoulos, who I haven't seen for a while, but we weren't able to cover the questions. We ran out of the beyond our allocated time, so we have to wrap it up here. On behalf of everybody, Nico, thank you very much for the work you did on the project, and of course for your very interesting presentation and the discussion that followed. Thanks also to the audience, and hopefully see you all in a future event by the Hellenic Observatory and the LSE.
So let me also express my gratitude for you for having us, and of course to everybody for participating, and me and my colleagues, because as I stressed, this is really joint work. We would be happy to continue this discussion.
We will, in different ways at different times. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Nico. Have a good evening.